What if I told you that a president once survived being shot, then gave a 90-minute speech with the bullet still lodged in his chest? Or that another president faced two assassination attempts in 17 days, both by women with loaded guns? Or that one president survived only because both pistols aimed at him from 6 feet away mysteriously misfired, back to back? Presidential assassination attempts aren't just footnotes in history books. They're moments where everything, policy, wars, entire decades of American life, hung on millimeters and mechanical failures and split-second reactions. Tonight, we're ranking every major assassination attempt and threat against U.S. presidents, not by how famous they were or what the political consequences might have been, but by one simple question: how close did they actually come to succeeding? If this sounds like your kind of historical rabbit hole, go ahead and subscribe. We do this kind of thing regularly, and your sleepy self will thank you later. Starting with the man who took a bullet and decided the speech was more important than the bleeding. Theodore Roosevelt, 1912. Hello. Welcome to the part of American history where we talk about presidents who almost died and somehow didn't. And we're starting with the big one, the gold standard. The story's so absurd that if you put it in a movie, people would say it was unrealistic. Theodore Roosevelt, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The man was campaigning for a third term as president. Well, technically a second elected term, but that's a whole different conversation about how he became president in the first place. The point is, he was giving speeches, shaking hands, doing the whole political rally thing that politicians do when they want people to vote for them, and then someone shot him in the chest. Just shot him. Point blank range. A man named John Schrenk walked up with a revolver and fired directly into Roosevelt's chest. The bullet entered his body. This is not a drill. This is not a metaphor. A projectile from a firearm physically entered the body of a former president of the United States. Now here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean completely unhinged in a way that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human biology and presidential stubbornness. Roosevelt did not go to the hospital. The bullet was inside him, literally inside his chest cavity. And Roosevelt looked at the situation, did some quick mental math, and decided that since he wasn't coughing up blood, he was probably fine. That was his medical assessment. Am I coughing blood? No? Then we're doing the speech. And he did. He gave the speech for 90 minutes with a bullet in his chest. He opened his coat to show the audience the bullet hole in his shirt. He pulled out his speech manuscript, which had a bullet hole clean through it, and he said, and this is a real quote, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he proceeded to deliver a campaign speech for an hour and a half while slowly bleeding internally. The speech manuscript saved his life. Well, that and his metal glasses case. See, Roosevelt kept his glasses in a metal case in his breast pocket, and he had folded his 50-page speech and put it in the same pocket. 50 pages. The man was planning to talk for a while, and when Schrank fired, the bullet had to go through both the metal glasses case and 50 pages of densely written paper before it could enter Roosevelt's body. This slowed the bullet down. Not enough to stop it, obviously. It still went into his chest, but enough that it didn't hit anything immediately fatal. The bullet lodged itself in his chest muscle, having cracked a rib on the way in, and just stayed there for the rest of his life. Roosevelt carried that bullet around in his body until he died in 1919, 7 years later. Doctors decided that removing it would be more dangerous than leaving it, so they just left it. There's something deeply strange about the idea of walking around with a bullet permanently embedded in your torso, but Roosevelt apparently didn't mind. Or if he did mind, he didn't let it stop him from doing anything, which was pretty much his approach to life in general. The assassin, John Schrank, was a saloon keeper from New York who had become convinced that Roosevelt was responsible for the assassination of William McKinley, which was paranoid nonsense, but Schrank had apparently had a dream where McKinley's ghost told him to avenge his death, so, you know, mental health resources in 1912 were not great. Schrank was declared insane and spent the rest of his life in mental institutions, which is probably where he should have been before he got his hands on a revolver, but that's hindsight for you. The really remarkable thing about this whole situation is how close it came to being a completely different story. If Roosevelt hadn't been carrying that speech, if he'd used a lighter glasses case, if the angle had been slightly different, we'd be talking about how Theodore Roosevelt was assassinated in Milwaukee instead of how he gave a speech with a bullet in his chest like some kind of indestructible political robot. The bullet missed his vital organs by inches. Inches. The difference between amusing historical anecdote about Roosevelt's toughness and national tragedy was about the width of a couple of fingers. And Roosevelt just kept going. After the speech, he finally agreed to go to the hospital, where doctors confirmed that yes, there was definitely a bullet in there, and no, they weren't going to take it out. He recovered, continued his campaign, though he didn't win the election, which must have been annoying after getting shot for it, and went on to live several more years of his extremely energetic life. There's something almost mythological about the whole thing. The image of Roosevelt standing on that stage, blood slowly seeping into his shirt, holding up his bullet-riddled speech and declaring that it takes more than that to kill him. It's the kind of moment that defines how we remember someone. Tough. Stubborn. Absolutely refusing to let something as minor as an assassination attempt get in the way of a good campaign speech. It's ranked number 1 on this list because of the sheer proximity to death combined with the absolute refusal to acknowledge that death was even a possibility. The bullet was inside him. He gave a 90-minute speech anyway. That's not normal. That's not how most people respond to being shot. But then again, Theodore Roosevelt was not most people. He was a man who owned a pet bear, who boxed regularly and went blind in one eye from a boxing injury while he was president, who went on safari and expedition and generally treated life like it was an adventure novel where he was the protagonist. Getting shot and giving a speech anyway fits perfectly into the Roosevelt mythology, which is probably part of why the story has endured. But it's not mythology. It's real. It happened. A man shot a former president in the chest, and that president looked at the situation and decided that the speech was more important than the bleeding. You have to admire the commitment, even if you question the judgment. And as we'll see, Roosevelt wasn't the only president who came absurdly close to dying in office, though he might be the only one who responded by pulling out a speech and getting to work. But speaking of presidents who narrowly escaped death through a combination of luck and quick medical intervention, we need to talk about what happened in 1981. Ronald Reagan, 1981. Ronald Reagan was shot on March 30th, 1981, 69 days into his presidency. 69 days. He'd barely unpacked. The man hadn't even had time to properly settle into the job, and someone was already shooting at him. Reagan had just finished giving a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel. He was walking out to his motorcade, doing the standard post-speech routine. Waving, smiling, being presidential. And then a man named John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots in about 1.7 seconds. 6 shots. Less than 2 seconds. And in that chaos of gunfire and Secret Service agents diving on top of people, one of those bullets hit the president. The thing is, Reagan didn't know he'd been shot at first. The Secret Service agent Jerry Parr grabbed him and shoved him into the presidential limousine. And Reagan thought he'd been injured by the force of being thrown into the car. He felt pain in his chest. He had trouble breathing. and he assumed he'd cracked a rib or something when Parr pushed him. It wasn't until he started coughing up blood that everyone realized something was very, very wrong. The bullet had entered under Reagan's left arm. His arm was raised in a wave when Hinckley fired, and it had bounced off the car, which changed its trajectory. This is important. The bullet ricocheted. It hit the limousine, flattened slightly, and then entered Reagan's body at an angle that nobody expected. It punctured his lung. It traveled through his chest cavity, and it stopped less than 1 inch from his heart. 1 inch, 25 millimeters, the width of a quarter. That's how close Ronald Reagan came to dying on a sidewalk outside a hotel in Washington. But here's what's remarkable about this story, aside from the obvious fact that the president almost died. Reagan, even while being shot, even while bleeding internally, even while his lung was collapsing, maintained this absolutely unshakable sense of humor that defined how people remember him. When the Secret Service rushed him into the emergency room at George Washington University Hospital, Reagan looked at the doctors and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." One of the doctors, who was actually a liberal Democrat, replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." It's the kind of exchange that sounds like it was written for a movie, but it actually happened. He told Nancy Reagan, his wife, "Honey, I forgot to duck." That was his opener. The man had been shot, his lung had collapsed, he was about to go into emergency surgery, and he was making jokes about boxing. And then, as they were wheeling him into surgery, he looked at the surgeons and said, "Please tell me you're Republicans." Same joke. Still funny, apparently. The surgery took hours. The doctors had to open his chest, remove the bullet, repair his lung, and drain the blood that had been filling his chest cavity. Reagan had lost over half his blood volume by the time they got him stabilized. He came as close to dying on that operating table as you can get without actually dying. But he survived. He was 70 years old, which is not young for a major surgery under the best circumstances, let alone after being shot. And he survived because the emergency response was fast, because the hospital was close, and because the bullet, despite everything, missed his heart by just enough. The assassination attempt had been carried out by John Hinckley Jr., who had developed an obsession with the actress Jodie Foster. He'd seen the movie Taxi Driver, in which the main character attempts to assassinate a presidential candidate to impress a woman, and Hinckley apparently thought this was a reasonable plan to get Foster's attention. It was not a reasonable plan. It was deeply delusional, and Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity, which led to major changes in insanity defense laws across the country. He spent decades in psychiatric care. 3 other people were shot that day along with Reagan. James Brady, the White House press secretary, was shot in the head and survived, but was permanently disabled. A Secret Service agent and a police officer were also wounded. The whole thing was captured on video. Grainy, chaotic footage that shows the moment the shots ring out and everyone starts moving at once. Reagan's recovery became part of his political mythology. He was back to work relatively quickly, though not as quickly as he probably should have been. There were photos of him working from his hospital bed, meeting with advisors, maintaining the image of strength and continuity even while his body was still healing from a collapsed lung and major surgery. The bullet scar remained with him for the rest of his life, obviously. You don't get shot in the chest and have major surgery without some permanent reminders. But Reagan rarely talked about it in personal terms. He made jokes, he referenced it in speeches occasionally, but the private impact of almost dying stayed mostly private. What ranks this assassination attempt so high on the list, second only to Roosevelt's, is the combination of factors. The bullet was inside the president's body. It punctured a vital organ. It stopped less than 1 inch from his heart. And if the Secret Service had been even slightly slower getting him to the hospital, if the hospital had been farther away, If the doctors had taken any longer to operate, Reagan would have died. The margin between president who survived an assassination attempt and president who was assassinated was measured in minutes and millimeters. That's terrifying when you think about it. The entire course of American history in the 1980s could have been completely different because of where one ricocheted bullet stopped. But it stopped where it stopped. Reagan survived. He went on to serve out his term, win re-election, and become one of the most politically significant presidents of the 20th century. And somewhere in an evidence locker, presumably, there's a flattened bullet that almost changed everything. But if you think that's as close as presidents have come to being killed in office, well, we need to talk about what happened in 1950 when someone actually made it inside the president's temporary residence with guns blazing. Harry S. Truman, 1950. Harry Truman was not living in the White House on November 1st, 1950. He was living in Blair House, which is directly across Pennsylvania Avenue, because the White House was literally falling apart and needed major renovations. The building was structurally unsound. The floors were sagging. There was a real possibility that someone could fall through the floor of the state dining room and die, which is not a good look for the official residence of the President of the United States. So Truman and his family moved across the street to Blair House while the White House got gutted and rebuilt from the inside. And it was while he was living there, in this temporary residence that wasn't designed to be a fortress, that two men tried to kill him. Their names were Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, and they were Puerto Rican nationalists who wanted to draw attention to the cause of Puerto Rican independence. Their plan, such as it was, involved walking up to Blair House in broad daylight and shooting their way in to kill the president. It was not a sophisticated plan. It was barely a plan at all. Very nearly worked. On that afternoon in November, Truman was upstairs taking a nap. He'd had lunch, he was resting before his next appointment, and he was completely unaware that two armed men were approaching the building. Blair House was guarded, but not heavily. There were Secret Service agents and White House police officers stationed outside, but nothing like the security that surrounds the president today. The men were standing post, watching the street, probably bored out of their minds because standing guard is monumentally boring right up until the moment it isn't. Collazo approached from one direction and pulled out a pistol. Torresola approached from another direction and did the same. And then they just started shooting. A police officer named Leslie Caufelt was standing guard at the basement entrance. Torresola shot him 3 times. Caufelt went down, mortally wounded, but before he died, he managed to draw his weapon and fire back. He shot Torresola in the head, killing him instantly. Caufelt died a few hours later in the hospital. He gave his life defending the president, and there's a plaque at Blair House commemorating his sacrifice, because that's what it was. The man was shot 3 times and still managed to eliminate the threat before he died. Meanwhile, Collazo was trying to get through the main entrance. Secret Service agents and police officers were firing at him. He was firing back, and the whole thing turned into a running gunfight on Pennsylvania Avenue in the middle of the day. Truman upstairs heard the gunfire and did what any reasonable person would do. He went to the window to see what was happening. Secret Service agents immediately started yelling at him to get away from the window because the President of the United States was standing in an open window during an active shooting. Just standing there, looking out at the gunfight happening on his front lawn. Truman was not known for his caution. The man had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here," and he meant it in every possible sense. He was direct, decisive, and not particularly interested in being protected from things he wanted to see for himself. But the agents convinced him to step back, and good thing too, because Collazo was still firing. He was wounded, he'd been shot multiple times, but he was still trying to get into the building. He was finally subdued and arrested, bleeding from his wounds. while Torsola lay dead on the sidewalk and Kofelt was dying from his injuries. The entire attack lasted less than 40 seconds. 40 seconds of absolute chaos. 27 shots fired in total. One attacker dead, one dying police officer, one wounded attacker, and several injured Secret Service agents and officers. And Truman upstairs, completely unharmed because the attackers never made it through the door. This ranks number 3 on the list because of how close they got. This wasn't a lone gunman firing from a distance. This wasn't a thwarted plot discovered before it could be executed. This was 2 armed men who made it to the president's door and started shooting. They were steps away. If the guards had been positioned differently, if Kofelt hadn't managed to shoot Torsola despite being mortally wounded himself, if Collazo had been a better shot or had better luck, the outcome could have been completely different. Truman could have been killed in his temporary residence because the White House was being renovated. It's the kind of irony that history sometimes offers up. The president survives because he's not where he's supposed to be, but then almost dies because where he is isn't as secure as where he's supposed to be. Collazo survived his wounds and was sentenced to death, but Truman later commuted his sentence to life in prison. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted his sentence again, and Collazo returned to Puerto Rico, where he lived until 1994. It's strange to think about. The man who tried to assassinate Harry Truman lived long enough to see the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, the world transforming completely. But on that day in 1950, he was part of a shooting that nearly killed a sitting president. And the only reason he failed was because the men guarding Blair House responded with incredible speed and courage, and because Leslie Kofelt, even while dying, took down one of the attackers. The Secret Service security protocols changed dramatically after this. Blair House got reinforced. Presidential protection became significantly more robust. And future presidents would be surrounded by layers of security that Truman, standing at that window watching a gunfight, couldn't have imagined. But before we move too far forward in history, we need to go backward and talk about something even more improbable than surviving 2 assassins with guns. We need to talk about the president who survived 2 guns that both refused to fire. Andrew Jackson, 1835. Andrew Jackson was 67 years old on January 30th, 1835, which means he was already living on borrowed time by the standards of the era. The man had been shot multiple times in duels throughout his life. He carried bullets in his body from previous encounters, just walking around with lead embedded in his chest and arm like some kind of 19th century cyborg. He'd been in somewhere between 5 and 100 duels, depending on which historian you ask and how you define duel, and he'd killed at least 1 man in single combat. This was not a person who lived cautiously. So when someone tried to assassinate him inside the United States Capitol building, Jackson's response was extremely on brand for who he was as a person. He beat the guy with his cane. But let's back up and talk about what happened, because the mechanical improbability of this situation is genuinely staggering. The kind of thing that makes you question whether reality has a sense of dramatic irony. Jackson was attending a funeral. A congressman had died, Representative Warren R. Davis of South Carolina, and Jackson, as president, was attending the funeral service being held in the Capitol. This was back when presidents could just go places, walk around, attend funerals without a motorcade and a security perimeter that would make a military base jealous. The concept of presidential security, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Presidents walked among crowds, shook hands with strangers, attended public events with minimal protection beyond maybe a few assistants walking with them. After the service, Jackson was leaving through the Capitol Rotunda, walking with his entourage, probably thinking about whatever presidents think about after funerals. Policy, maybe? Lunch. Whether his various embedded bullets were bothering him that day. The weather, the normal concerns of a 19th century head of state who happened to be carrying around several pieces of lead from previous violent encounters, and then a man stepped out of the crowd, raised a pistol, pointed it directly at Jackson from about 6 feet away, and pulled the trigger. The gun didn't fire. Now, this wasn't a misfire in the sense of the gun jamming or the bullet getting stuck. The percussion cap detonated. There was a small explosion, the sharp crack of the cap going off. The mechanism worked exactly as it was supposed to work, but the main charge, the gunpowder that was supposed to propel the bullet out of the barrel and into the President of the United States, simply didn't ignite. The flame from the percussion cap failed to ignite the main powder charge, which is the entire point of a percussion cap system. The gun went click instead of bang, and Jackson, instead of being shot, was just standing there, very much alive and increasingly angry. The assassin's name was Richard Lawrence, and he was either remarkably committed or remarkably deluded, because he immediately pulled out a second pistol. He had come prepared with two guns, which suggests a level of planning that makes the subsequent failure even more bizarre. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This wasn't someone who grabbed a gun and ran toward the president in a fit of rage. Lawrence had thought about this. He'd acquired two pistols. He'd loaded them both. He'd concealed them both. He'd positioned himself in the crowd at the funeral. And now he was going to use the backup weapon. Lawrence aimed the second pistol at Jackson, again from point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. The second gun also misfired. Same exact failure. The percussion cap detonated, the mechanism functioned, but the main powder charge refused to ignite. Two guns, two misfires. Same situation, same conditions, same desperately unfortunate assassin standing in the Capitol Rotunda, holding a useless weapon, while Andrew Jackson glared at him with the kind of fury that only a man who has survived multiple gunfights can really muster. The odds of one percussion cap pistol misfiring under normal conditions are relatively low. The percussion cap system was specifically invented because it was more reliable than earlier firing mechanisms. It was supposed to be the solution to misfires. And yet here we are, with both of Lawrence's pistols failing in exactly the same way, in sequence, during the same assassination attempt. Later testing showed that both guns were in working order. After Lawrence was arrested, after the immediate crisis was over, investigators test-fired both pistols. They worked perfectly. Both of them fired without any issues. The guns themselves were fine. The mechanism was sound. There was nothing mechanically wrong with either weapon. But in that moment, in the Capitol Rotunda, with an angry Andrew Jackson staring him down, both of Richard Lawrence's pistols betrayed him completely. And Jackson, who had survived multiple duels, multiple gunshot wounds, and what was probably a lifetime of undiagnosed health issues, looked at this man who had just tried to shoot him twice and decided that the appropriate response was immediate and personal violence. He went after Lawrence with his cane. Jackson was 67 years old. He was not in good health by any reasonable standard. He suffered from chronic pain from his old gunshot wounds. He had respiratory issues. He had what were probably several untreated medical conditions that would have been easily manageable with modern medicine, but were just accepted as part of life in the 1830s. And he charged at his would-be assassin, raising his cane like a club, fully prepared to beat this man to death in the Capitol Rotunda in front of witnesses and God and everyone. Several people intervened. Congressman Davy Crockett, yes, that Davy Crockett, because apparently this story needed to be even more absurdly historical, helped restrain Lawrence along with several other bystanders. They pulled Jackson back, they subdued Lawrence, and the assassination attempt was over. But not before Jackson got in at least one good hit with his cane, because, of course, he did. The image remains. An elderly president who had just survived two shots that should have killed him only because both guns mysteriously failed, attacking his assassin with a walking stick in the heart of the Capitol building, while famous frontiersmen held him back. Richard Lawrence was tried for attempted assassination and found not guilty by reason of insanity. He believed he was King Richard III of England, not a descendant of Richard III, not someone with a claim to the throne. He believed he was literally King Richard III, somehow alive in 1835 America and being denied his rightful property by the United States government. He believed that the United States government owed him money. He believed that killing Andrew Jackson would somehow restore his rightful position and fortune and reveal his true identity to the world. He was, by all accounts and any reasonable standard, deeply mentally unwell. There was no question about his delusions. Multiple doctors examined him. His family testified about his increasingly bizarre behavior in the months leading up to the attempt. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in mental institutions, dying in 1861 without ever regaining what we might call a normal connection to reality. But the question that historians still debate, the question that hangs over this entire bizarre incident is, what were the odds? The Smithsonian Institution later examined the pistols. They were in working order. When they test fired them, both guns worked perfectly. The ammunition was fine. The mechanisms were sound. Everything about those weapons was exactly as it should have been. And yet, in that moment, both failed. The weather that day in Washington was humid, which can affect gunpowder. Moisture can infiltrate powder charges, especially if the weapons have been loaded for a while, and can prevent proper ignition. But this doesn't usually cause complete failure in two separate weapons, loaded at different times with different powder charges. It's possible, but unlikely. Some historians have theorized that the humidity combined with the specific characteristics of the gunpowder used at the time created a perfect storm of malfunction. Others simply point to it as an extraordinary coincidence, the kind of thing that happens occasionally in a universe that doesn't care about dramatic probability. Jackson himself apparently believed it was divine intervention. He reportedly said later that he believed Providence had protected him, that God had prevented those guns from firing because his work on Earth wasn't finished yet, which is one interpretation of events, and not an uncommon one for someone of Jackson's time and religious background. Another interpretation is that Richard Lawrence had spectacularly bad luck combined with poorly maintained weapons. Perhaps he'd loaded them days or weeks before, and the powder had absorbed moisture, and Andrew Jackson had spectacularly good luck combined with a violent temperament that made him charge at people with a cane when they tried to kill him. What makes this rank as number 4 on the list is the proximity and the impossibility. 6 feet away, point blank range, 2 pistols, both aimed directly at the president, both fired with intent to kill, both mechanically sound weapons that should have worked, and both failed consecutively in the same attack. If even one of those guns had worked as intended, Andrew Jackson would have been the first president assassinated in office 26 years before Abraham Lincoln. American history would have been completely different. The political landscape of the 1830s would have been transformed. Jackson's policies, his influence, his entire legacy would have been cut short in a Capitol funeral. But both guns failed. The assassination attempt became a historical curiosity rather than a historical tragedy. And Jackson lived another 10 years, dying in 1845 at his home in Tennessee at the age of 78, having outlived his would-be assassin's sanity and his own numerous health problems and the countless other dangers that came with being Andrew Jackson. The incident changed very little about presidential security at the time, which is remarkable in itself. You'd think that having someone attempt to shoot the president inside the Capitol would lead to some kind of policy change, some recognition that maybe presidents needed protection. But early America was a different world. Presidents walked around with minimal protection. They shook hands with strangers. They attended public events without security cordons. The idea that someone might want to kill the president was understood, but not taken particularly seriously in terms of preventive measures. It wouldn't be until much later, after actual successful assassinations, after Lincoln and Garfield and McKinley, that presidential protection became the elaborate, multi layered operation it is today. In 1835, Andrew Jackson's protection consisted of the people who happened to be standing nearby when someone tried to shoot him. But for Andrew Jackson, on that day in January, all he needed was 2 faulty pistols and a sturdy cane. And perhaps, if you believed him, a little help from Providence. Though, as we'll see, Providence doesn't always show up when you need it. And sometimes survival comes down to split-second movements and trained security personnel responding faster than an attacker can aim. Donald Trump, 2024, Butler, Pennsylvania. Butler, Pennsylvania, July 13th, 2024. An outdoor campaign rally, the kind of event that happens constantly during election cycles, with stages and crowds and security perimeters that are supposed to prevent exactly what happened. The kind of event where security is planned weeks in advance, where Secret Service conducts site surveys, where every rooftop and sightline is supposed to be accounted for and secured. Donald Trump was speaking, doing the standard campaign speech thing, talking to a crowd of supporters, gesturing, making his points, working the crowd the way politicians do when they're trying to energize their base and win an election. It was early evening. The weather was clear. Everything about the event was proceeding normally, which is to say it was proceeding exactly as it had at dozens of other rallies in the campaign. And then there was the sharp crack of gunfire, and everything changed in an instant. A bullet passed through the upper part of Trump's right ear. Not past it, not near it. Through it. The projectile struck his ear and kept going. And the only reason it didn't strike something considerably more vital is because Trump moved his head at precisely the moment the shot was fired. We're talking about split-second timing here. Fractions of a second. The difference between that was close and that was fatal, measured in millimeters and milliseconds. If Trump had been standing slightly differently, if he turned his head a moment earlier or later, if the timing had been off by the tiniest fraction, we'd be discussing a completely different outcome. The shooter was positioned on a rooftop approximately 130 yards away. That's about 390 feet, which is not a difficult shot for someone with basic marksmanship training and a rifle. It's well within the range where you should be able to hit what you're aiming at if you know what you're doing and if you have a stable platform and if you account for wind and distance properly. The shooter had an elevated position, a clear line of sight to the stage, and apparently enough time to set up and take the shot without being stopped. And he nearly succeeded. The photographs from that moment are extraordinary in a horrifying way. Professional news photographers were there doing their jobs, capturing the event, and their cameras caught everything. You can see Trump reaching up to his ear in the photographs. You can see the blood on his face and hand. You can see the moment of realization crossing his expression that something has just happened, something violent and unexpected. And you can see the Secret Service agents already in motion, already responding before most people in the crowd have even processed that shots were fired. Secret Service agents immediately swarmed him, covering his body with their own, pushing him down behind the podium, creating a human shield between him and wherever the shots were coming from. This is what they're trained to do, what they drill constantly, what the entire protective methodology is built around. When shots are fired at a protectee, you cover them, you move them, you get between them and the threat. Your body becomes the barrier between the threat and the person you're protecting. And they did it within seconds, which is remarkable when you consider that the human brain needs time to process what's happening. Gunshots in a crowded outdoor venue could be anything: fireworks, a car backfiring, a burst balloon, someone dropping something heavy. There's a moment of confusion where your brain is trying to categorize the sound, trying to decide if it's a threat. But the Secret Service agents didn't wait to figure it out conclusively. They heard the shots and they moved, training overriding the natural human instinct to pause and assess. Trump went down behind the podium. Agents piled on top of him, their bodies covering his, protecting his head and vital organs with their own flesh. And somewhere in that chaos, other agents were locating and neutralizing the shooter. Counter sniper teams, positioned specifically to respond to this kind of threat, acquired the target and returned fire. The shooter, Thomas Matthew Crooks, was killed by Secret Service marksmen within seconds of firing his first shots. One person in the crowd died. Corey Comparatore, a 50-year-old former fire chief who was at the rally with his family, was killed while shielding his wife and daughters from the gunfire. 2 other attendees were critically injured. The shooter fired multiple rounds before he was stopped, and while Trump was the intended target, other people paid the price for that intent. This is what happens in these situations. Bullets don't stop being lethal just because they missed their intended target. When the agents finally moved Trump off the stage, when they determined it was safe enough to move him to the armored vehicle, he insisted on standing up. This is visible in the photographs and videos that circulated afterward. The agents are trying to move him quickly, trying to get him to the vehicle where he'll be protected by armor and bulletproof glass, and Trump is pushing back against them, standing up, raising his fist to the crowd, shouting. It's either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless depending on your perspective and your political inclinations. Because for all anyone knew in that moment, there could have been a second shooter. There could have been multiple threats. The smart move, the safe move, was to stay down and let the agents move you to safety. But there wasn't a second shooter. There was one shooter, Thomas Matthew Crooks, a 20-year-old from Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, who had climbed onto the roof of a nearby building with an AR-style rifle and opened fire on a presidential candidate during a campaign rally. His motivations remain unclear, which is often the case in these situations. Sometimes there's a manifesto or a clear ideological motivation. Sometimes there's nothing but speculation and questions that will never be fully answered. The investigation afterward raised serious questions about security. How did someone get onto a rooftop that close to the stage with a rifle? Why wasn't that building secured as part of the security perimeter? How did the shooter have time to set up and take multiple shots before being neutralized? These are the kinds of questions that get asked after every security failure, and they're important questions. They lead to reviews and changes in protocol, and hopefully better protection in the future. But they don't change what happened. What happened was that Donald Trump came within inches, perhaps less than an inch, of being killed. The bullet grazed his ear, leaving a visible wound that required medical attention. If his head had been positioned slightly differently, if the timing had been fractionally different, if he hadn't moved at that exact moment, we'd be talking about something completely different. We'd be discussing the assassination of a former president during a campaign rally, and the political implications would have been seismic. This ranks as number 5 on the list because of that proximity. The shot was on target. The shooter had the capability and the position, and apparently enough time to set up properly. The bullet made contact with Trump's body, even if not with a vital area. And the only thing that prevented a fatal hit was movement that Trump himself probably wasn't even conscious of making in that moment. Sometimes survival comes down to luck and timing rather than planning or skill. It's also notable because it happened so recently. We're used to thinking about assassination attempts as historical events, things that happened to Roosevelt or Reagan or Kennedy, events from decades ago that we study in history books. But this was 2024. Modern security, modern technology, modern Secret Service training and protocols, and still, someone got close enough and prepared enough to take a shot that nearly killed a presidential candidate. But as we're about to see, surviving one attempt doesn't mean you're done with attempts, and sometimes history has a dark sense of repetition. Gerald Ford, 1975. Gerald Ford had been president for less than a year when someone first tried to kill him. He'd become president in 1974 without being elected. He was appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace, and then became president when Richard Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment, which made Ford the only person to serve as both vice president and president without ever being elected to either office. So Ford was already having a weird time of it, politically speaking. He was cleaning up other people's messes, trying to heal a nation traumatized by Watergate, and dealing with an economy that was struggling and a public that was deeply cynical about government. And then in September of 1975, things got significantly weirder and considerably more dangerous. Ford was in Sacramento, California on September 5th. He was walking through a crowd of supporters in Capitol Park on his way to meet with Governor Jerry Brown, shaking hands, doing the standard presidential greeting routine. This was back when presidents still did walkabouts through crowds, before security protocols became so restrictive that spontaneous contact with the public became nearly impossible. Ford was greeting people, smiling, being presidential, and a woman in the crowd pulled out a gun. Her name was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, and she was a follower of Charles Manson, which should give you some sense of her mental state and decision-making processes. She was part of the Manson family, that group of devoted followers who had committed murders at Manson's direction and who continued to revere him even after he was imprisoned for life. Fromm hadn't participated in the actual murders, but she remained loyal to Manson and his bizarre ideology. She raised a Colt .45 pistol and pointed it directly at President Ford from approximately 2 feet away. 2 feet. That's closer than most people stand when they're having a conversation. That's intimate distance range, well inside personal space. That's close enough to see someone's expression clearly, close enough to shake hands, and definitely close enough to shoot someone with complete certainty of hitting them. At that range, missing would require trying to miss. Fromm pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun didn't fire, but not because of a mechanical failure, not because of humidity or faulty percussion caps or any of the technical issues that saved Andrew Jackson 140 years earlier. The gun didn't fire because there wasn't a round in the chamber. The magazine was loaded. There were 4 cartridges in the magazine. But Fromm had either forgotten to chamber a round or didn't understand how to properly operate the firearm. She had a loaded gun but hadn't completed the steps necessary to make it actually fire. A Secret Service agent named Larry Bundorf saw what was happening and reacted instantly. He grabbed her, got his hand between the hammer and the firing pin, preventing the gun from firing even if she somehow managed to chamber a round, and pulled the trigger again. Other agents surrounded Ford and hustled him away from the crowd, moving him quickly into his car and out of the area. The entire encounter lasted seconds. Fromm was arrested on the spot, eventually sentenced to life in prison, and the whole incident became a bizarre footnote in American presidential history. The Charles Manson follower who tried to shoot Gerald Ford but forgot to put a bullet in the chamber. She served 34 years in federal prison before being released on parole in 2009. You would think that would be enough. You would think that one assassination attempt would be sufficient excitement for any president's tenure. You would think that having someone point a loaded gun at you from 2 feet away would be the worst thing that could happen in a given month. You would be wrong. 17 days later, just over 2 weeks, on September 22nd, 1975, Gerald Ford was in San Francisco. He was leaving the St. Francis Hotel after giving a speech, walking to his car, waving to the crowd that had gathered outside to see him. and another woman in the crowd pulled out a gun. Her name was Sarah Jane Moore, and unlike Squeaky Fromm, Moore actually understood how guns worked and definitely had a round chambered and was fully prepared to shoot the President of the United States. She'd bought the gun legally the day before, actually bought it twice because she'd bought one. The authorities had confiscated it because they'd been monitoring her due to her radical political connections, and then she'd immediately bought another one. She'd practiced at a firing range. She'd sighted it in. She knew what she was doing. She raised a .38 caliber revolver and aimed it at President Ford from about 40 feet away. 40 feet is a much harder shot than 2 feet, but it's still well within the effective range of a revolver in the hands of someone who has any idea what they're doing. It's not a sniper shot, but it's an achievable shot for someone with basic firearms competency and a steady hand. Moore had practiced. She was ready. She fired. At the exact moment she pulled the trigger, a bystander named Oliver Sipple, a former Marine who happened to be standing next to her in the crowd, saw what was happening and grabbed her arm. Just reached out and grabbed her arm as she was firing. The gun went off, the bullet went wide, missing Ford by several feet and hitting the building behind him instead. And Oliver Sipple had just saved the president's life through a split-second reaction that he probably didn't even consciously decide to make. Moore fired again, or tried to, but Sipple and other bystanders were wrestling her to the ground by that point, and the shot went wild, not even close to hitting anyone. Secret Service agents surrounded Ford and got him into the car immediately. He was unhurt. He hadn't even known he'd been shot at until agents told him what had happened. The agents moving so fast that Ford was in the car and leaving before he fully understood the situation. 2 assassination attempts. 17 days apart. Both in California. Both by women, which was unusual enough that it became part of how the incidents were reported and discussed. Both involving firearms at relatively close range in public settings with crowds of people around. Both stopped, not primarily by Secret Service intervention, but by the attacker's incompetence or a bystander's quick reaction. Ford continued his presidency, served out his term, and lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter. He went on to live a long post-presidential life, dying in 2006 at the age of 93, having survived not only 2 assassination attempts, but also his tenure as the only unelected president in American history, the Nixon pardon controversy, and the general chaos of the mid-70s. What makes these incidents rank as number 6 on the list is the combination of proximity, repetition, and the fact that both attempts came genuinely close to succeeding through very different means. Fromm was 2 feet away with a loaded gun. If she'd understood how to chamber a round, Ford would have been shot at point-blank range with very little chance of survival. Moore was 40 feet away with a properly functioning weapon and fired directly at the president. If Oliver Sipple hadn't reacted as fast as he did, if his timing had been even slightly off, that bullet would likely have hit its target. 2 attempts in barely over 2 weeks sent a message that presidential security needed to be fundamentally reconsidered, and it was Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1933. Roosevelt wasn't president yet when someone tried to kill him. He was president-elect, which is almost worse in a way, because he'd won the election but hadn't taken office yet. He was in that strange liminal period between being a private citizen and being the most powerful person in the country, and apparently someone decided that was the perfect time for an assassination attempt. It was February 15th, 1933. Roosevelt had been in Miami, Florida, giving a speech at Bayfront Park. This was during the interregnum period, the time between the November election and the March inauguration, which back then was a full 4 months instead of the 2.5 months we have now. Roosevelt had won the 1932 election in a landslide, defeating Herbert Hoover during the depths of the Great Depression. And he was traveling, giving speeches, preparing to take office. The speech at Bayfront Park was informal, delivered from the back of an open car rather than from a proper stage. Roosevelt couldn't stand without assistance due to his paralysis from polio, so he often gave speeches from vehicles, sitting in the back seat where crowds could see him. It was a compromise between his disability and the public's desire to see their leaders in person. After the speech, Roosevelt was sitting in the car, talking with various officials and dignitaries who had come to greet him. Anton Chermak, the mayor of Chicago, was there. Several other local politicians were standing around the car. It was the kind of post-speech meet and greet that happens at political events, with people pressing in to shake hands and exchange a few words with the president-elect. And then a man named Giuseppe Zangara pulled out a .32 caliber pistol and started shooting. Zangara was standing on a wobbly bench about 25 feet from Roosevelt's car. He was 5 feet tall, and he needed the extra height to see over the crowd. He fired 5 shots in rapid succession, and the entire scene descended into chaos. Here's the remarkable thing. Roosevelt was not hit, not even grazed. 5 shots fired at a target 25 feet away, and none of them hit the president-elect. But other people were hit. 5 other people, in fact. Anton Chermak, the mayor of Chicago, was shot in the chest. 4 other bystanders were wounded. The bullets went everywhere except into Franklin Roosevelt, who was sitting in an open car, a large and stationary target, completely unable to run or take cover due to his paralysis. Several factors saved Roosevelt that night. First, Zangara was short and was standing on an unstable bench, which affected his aim. Second, a woman named Lillian Cross, who was standing near Zangara, grabbed his arm after the first shot, disrupting his aim for the subsequent shots. Third, the crowd surged toward him, people instinctively trying to stop the shooter, which threw off his aim even further. But Roosevelt's response to the shooting is what makes this story truly remarkable. After the shots rang out, after the initial chaos, after Secret Service agents surrounded the car and everyone was yelling and confused, Roosevelt ordered his driver to stop. Anton Chermak had been loaded into another car, wounded and in serious condition, and Roosevelt demanded that Chermak be brought to his car instead. They put the dying mayor in the car with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt held him, talked to him, tried to comfort him during the drive to the hospital. There are photographs of Roosevelt at the hospital, blood on his suit from holding Chermak. The president-elect, who had just survived an assassination attempt, was covered in another man's blood because he'd insisted on trying to save him. Chermak died 19 days later from his wounds. His last words were reportedly, "I'm glad it was me instead of you," spoken to Roosevelt. Though there's some historical debate about whether he actually said this, or whether it was a later romantic addition to the story. But the sentiment was real. Chermak had been shot while standing near Roosevelt, and Roosevelt had held him as he died. The other 4 people who were shot survived their injuries. Zangara was arrested immediately, still holding the pistol. His motivation was strange and somewhat incoherent. He claimed he hated all presidents and all capitalists. He said he had chronic stomach pain that had made his life miserable, and he blamed capitalists and leaders for his suffering. He showed no remorse for shooting Chermak or the other bystanders. He was angry that he'd missed Roosevelt. Zangara was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death with remarkable speed. He was executed in the electric chair on March 20th, 1933, just 33 days after the shooting. His last words were reportedly, "Push the button," shouted at his executioner, because apparently he was in a hurry to get the execution over with. This assassination attempt ranks as number 7 on the list for several reasons. First, the shooter fired multiple shots at relatively close range at a stationary target. Second, while Roosevelt himself wasn't hit, 5 other people were shot, including one fatally, which demonstrates how close the situation came to complete disaster. Third, Roosevelt's paralysis meant he couldn't run or take cover. If any of those bullets had been aimed slightly differently, if Lillian Cross hadn't grabbed Zangara's arm, If the crowd hadn't surged forward, Roosevelt would have been a sitting target with no ability to protect himself. The incident had political consequences beyond the immediate violence. It reinforced the public's perception of Roosevelt as calm and brave under pressure. The image of him holding the wounded mayor covered in blood, trying to comfort a dying man, became part of his political mythology. Here was a man who had overcome polio, who had rebuilt his life and his political career, who remained composed during an assassination attempt and focused on helping others rather than on his own safety. It also led to changes in how presidents elect were protected. The Secret Service had been protecting Roosevelt, but the protection was minimal by modern standards. The fact that someone could get within 25 feet with a loaded pistol and fire multiple shots suggested that security needed to be significantly enhanced. Roosevelt went on to serve as president for 12 years, the longest tenure in American history, winning 4 presidential elections before dying in office in 1945. He led the country through the Great Depression and most of World War II. He fundamentally reshaped the role of the federal government and the presidency itself. But before all of that, before the New Deal and the fireside chats and the wartime leadership, he survived an assassination attempt in Miami because a short man standing on a wobbly bench couldn't aim straight, and because a woman in the crowd grabbed the shooter's arm at exactly the right moment. The randomness of it is striking. 5 shots fired. None of them hit the intended target. 5 other people shot instead, including a mayor who died from his wounds. The entire trajectory of American history in the 1930s and 40s came down to the stability of a bench and the quick reaction of a bystander. Roosevelt's luck that night in Miami would hold for the rest of his presidency. He would face countless challenges and crises, but no one would try to assassinate him again. He would die in office, but from a cerebral hemorrhage, not from violence. And the man who tried to kill him would be executed 33 days later, a footnote in history, while Roosevelt would become one of the most consequential presidents in American history. But as we'll see, not every assassination attempt involves shots fired in public. Sometimes the threat is caught before it can be executed. Sometimes it's disrupted by intelligence and law enforcement working together. And sometimes the danger comes from a direction no one expected. Donald Trump, 2024, Florida incident. The second assassination attempt against Donald Trump during the 2024 campaign was a different beast entirely from what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. This one didn't involve shots fired into a crowd. This one didn't result in injuries or deaths among bystanders. This one was caught early, disrupted before it could fully develop, which is exactly how security is supposed to work, but rarely does in a way that makes headlines. It happened in September of 2024 at Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, Florida. Trump was golfing, which is something he did frequently throughout his time in public life. Golf courses present interesting security challenges. They're large, open spaces with limited sight lines, multiple entry and exit points, and they're typically surrounded by vegetation that can provide concealment. They're not ideal from a protection standpoint, but they're also not places where you can reasonably restrict all access without shutting down the entire facility. Trump was on the course with his Secret Service detail. The protective methodology for a principal on a golf course typically involves agents positioned ahead of the principal, surveying the route, and agents maintaining a perimeter around the active area. It's a moving security bubble that shifts as the principal moves from hole to hole. A Secret Service agent doing exactly what they're trained to do spotted something wrong. Someone was in the tree line near the 6th hole, in an area where no one should have been. The agent saw the barrel of a rifle poking through the fence line, pointed toward where Trump would be passing. The agent engaged immediately. He fired at the suspect, who dropped the rifle and fled. This is the key difference between this incident and Butler. The threat was identified and engaged before the suspect could fire at the protectee. The security system worked as designed. Someone was in position to take a shot, and they were stopped before they could take that shot. The suspect, identified as Ryan Wesley Routh, fled the scene but was apprehended shortly afterward during a traffic stop on a nearby highway. Law enforcement found an AK-style rifle with a scope, 2 backpacks, and a GoPro camera at the scene. The camera suggests he may have been planning to record the attack, which adds a disturbing dimension to the incident. This wasn't just about killing a presidential candidate. This was potentially about creating media of the killing. The investigation revealed that Routh had been at the golf course for approximately 12 hours before being spotted. 12 hours. He'd set up position in the tree line in the early morning and waited, presumably watching the golf course, waiting for Trump to appear. That's not a spur-of-the-moment decision. That's not someone acting impulsively. That's someone who had planned this, who had scouted the location, who had the patience to wait half a day for an opportunity. Cell phone records and other evidence suggested Routh had been surveilling Trump's movements and locations for some time. He'd been to the golf course before. He'd been near Mar-a-Lago, Trump's residence. This was stalking behavior escalating to an assassination attempt. This was someone who had decided to kill a presidential candidate and was methodically working toward that goal. Routh's background added complexity to the story. He'd apparently traveled to Ukraine and tried to recruit fighters for the Ukrainian military in their conflict with Russia. He'd posted extensively on social media about politics and international affairs. He'd had previous run-ins with law enforcement, including a previous conviction for possession of a weapon of mass destruction, specifically a fully automatic machine gun, back in 2002. How someone with that background was able to get close to a presidential candidate with a rifle is one of the questions that emerged from this incident. How did he know Trump would be at the golf course that day? Was Trump's schedule compromised? Was this just patient observation of Trump's habits? These are the kinds of questions that security reviews focus on after an incident like this. This attempt ranks as number 8 on the list because, while it was credible and dangerous, a man with a rifle in position to potentially take a shot at a presidential candidate, it was stopped before shots were fired at the principal. The threat was real, the intent was clear, but the execution was disrupted by alert security personnel doing their job correctly. It's lower on the list than Butler because no shots were fired at Trump, no one was injured, and the security perimeter held. But it's still high on the list because of the preparation involved, the amount of time the suspect spent in position, and the fact that if that Secret Service agent had been looking in a different direction, if the suspect had been positioned slightly differently, if the timing had been different, this could have been a very different story. The incident raised questions about how Trump's movements and schedule were being monitored. Golf outings are often spontaneous, but there are still logistics involved. Advanced teams survey the location. Local law enforcement is notified. There are coordination calls and security briefings. Information about a protectee's movements has to be shared among various agencies and personnel, and each sharing is a potential point where that information could be compromised. It also highlighted the challenge of protecting someone on a golf course. Unlike a rally where you can establish a clear perimeter and control access points, a golf course is fundamentally an open environment. The course itself is large. It's bordered by roads and residential areas and vegetation. You can't secure every sight line. You can't control every angle of approach. The best you can do is maintain vigilance and respond quickly to threats, which is exactly what happened in this case. Ruth was charged with attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, among other federal charges. Unlike the Butler shooter who was killed at the scene, Routh survived to face prosecution, which means there will be a trial. Evidence will be presented and we'll potentially learn more about his motivations and planning. What's notable about having two assassination attempts in the same campaign season is the pattern it suggests. Whether these were copycat situations, one attempt inspiring another, or independent actions by unrelated individuals with similar ideologies is something investigators will determine. But the fact that two separate people decided that killing this particular presidential candidate was worth attempting speaks to something about the current political climate and the intensity of political divisions in America. Trump continued campaigning after this incident, just as he continued after Butler. The Florida attempt got less media coverage than Butler, partly because no shots were fired at Trump himself, partly because no one was killed or injured, and partly because the second assassination attempt in a campaign season becomes horrifyingly less newsworthy than the first. But from a security standpoint, this incident might actually be more concerning in some ways than Butler. Butler was a failure of perimeter security. Someone got onto a rooftop they shouldn't have been able to access, but they were relatively exposed and they were neutralized quickly once they fired. Florida was someone who managed to surveil the target, identify patterns, get into position, and wait for 12 hours before being spotted. That suggests a more methodical and potentially more dangerous threat profile. The fact that the security system caught it before shots were fired is the good news. The bad news is that it required an alert agent spotting a rifle barrel through fence line vegetation, a tiny detail that could easily have been missed. And if it had been missed, we'd be discussing a very different outcome. But it wasn't missed. The agent saw the threat. The agent engaged, the suspect fled. The system worked, and Trump survived to continue his campaign, protected by the same Secret Service that had twice prevented attempts on his life within a span of weeks. Though, as we'll see, not every threat to presidents involves sophisticated planning or rifles. Sometimes the threat comes from much stranger places, with much stranger weapons. Jimmy Carter, 1979. Jimmy Carter was president during a time when presidential security was being fundamentally reconsidered. The assassination attempts against Gerald Ford had happened just a few years earlier. The memory of JFK's assassination in Dallas was still relatively fresh in the national consciousness. The Secret Service was more vigilant, more paranoid, more likely to investigate threats that might have been dismissed in earlier eras. And then, in May of 1979, they uncovered a plot involving a man, a starter pistol, and what appeared to be a confused plan that relied more on chaos than actual lethality. The man's name was Raymond Lee Harvey. He was arrested in Los Angeles on May 5th, 1979, just hours before President Carter was scheduled to appear at a civic center for a Democratic fundraising dinner. Harvey was found with a starter pistol, the kind used at track meets to signal the beginning of races, which fires blanks rather than bullets, and he was loitering suspiciously near the event venue. Now, a starter pistol is not a lethal weapon in the traditional sense. It doesn't fire projectiles. It makes a loud bang. But it doesn't shoot bullets that can kill people at a distance. But here's the thing about starter pistols and presidential security. They sound exactly like real guns. The crack of a starter pistol going off in a crowd sounds like gunfire, and when people hear gunfire near the president, chaos ensues. Harvey's plan, according to his statements to police and Secret Service agents, was to fire the starter pistol to create a distraction. This distraction would supposedly allow other individuals, accomplices he claimed were part of the plot, to fire real weapons at the president during the confusion. It was a plan that relied on misdirection, on creating chaos that would overwhelm security protocols and allow the real assassins to act while everyone was focused on the wrong threat. Except there's significant debate about whether these accomplices actually existed or whether Harvey was constructing a conspiracy that was mostly in his imagination. He named names. He described other people who were supposedly involved. He talked about a coordinated plan. But investigators were never able to conclusively verify that these other conspirators were real or that there was actually a broader plot beyond Harvey himself with a starter pistol. Harvey had a history of mental health issues and substance abuse problems. He was living on the streets. His story changed multiple times during interrogation. He provided details that didn't always match up with reality. The investigation into his alleged accomplices didn't produce arrests or evidence of a broader conspiracy. So, what we're left with is significant uncertainty about the true nature of the threat. Was this a genuine assassination plot involving multiple people with real weapons, with Harvey as the designated distraction? Or was this one unstable individual with a starter pistol and a fantasy about being part of something bigger? The Secret Service had to take it seriously either way. You can't take chances with presidential security. If someone says they're part of a plot to kill the president, you investigate thoroughly, even if that person seems unreliable or mentally unwell. Because the one time you dismiss a threat as nonsense could be the time it turns out to be real. Carter's event was not canceled. The president appeared as scheduled, gave his speech, and left without incident. Security was heightened, obviously. The Secret Service was on alert for any sign of additional threats, but nothing happened. Harvey was in custody. His alleged accomplices, if they existed, either didn't show up or never existed in the first place. Harvey was charged with threatening the president, but the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence that he posed a credible threat. The investigation concluded without any definitive answers about whether there had been a real conspiracy or just one confused individual with a starter pistol and an overactive imagination. This incident ranks as number 9 on the list specifically because of the ambiguity and the nature of the weapon involved. A starter pistol is not a lethal weapon on its own. The threat level was dependent on whether Harvey's story about accomplices with real guns was true, and that was never definitively established. The plot, if it existed, was disrupted before execution through advanced surveillance and arrest, which is exactly how security should work, but which also means we never got to find out how real the threat actually was. It's a lower stakes entry compared to attempts where shots were actually fired or where the threat was unambiguous, but it's still significant because it shows the range of threats that presidents face. Not every assassination attempt involves a lone gunman with clear intent and a functioning weapon. Sometimes it's messy and confusing and involves people whose grip on reality is questionable and plans that don't make complete sense. The Secret Service can't afford to dismiss these situations just because they seem confused or unlikely. Every threat has to be investigated. Every suspicious person near a presidential event has to be questioned. Every weapon, even a non-lethal one that could create chaos, has to be taken seriously. Carter was aware of the incident, but continued with his public schedule, which was his standard approach. Carter was not someone who let security concerns keep him from public engagement. He was famously accessible for a president, sometimes frustratingly so from a Secret Service perspective. He would wade into crowds, shake hands with strangers, interact with the public in ways that made his security detail nervous. This incident didn't change that approach. Carter continued to be relatively accessible, continued to attend public events, continued to prioritize connecting with citizens even if it meant some level of risk. The calculations seemed to be that the benefits of public engagement outweighed the risks, and that adequate security could be provided without turning the president into an isolated figure behind walls and barriers. It's worth noting that this threat emerged in Los Angeles, far from the White House during a fundraising trip. Presidents don't just face threats in Washington. They travel constantly, appearing in cities across the country, and each location presents new security challenges. The Secret Service has to coordinate with local law enforcement, survey new venues, establish security perimeters in unfamiliar territory. It's a logistical nightmare that happens regularly, and the fact that threats are identified and neutralized in these situations is a testament to the coordination between agencies. The Harvey incident was resolved without violence, without shots fired, without anyone being injured. From a security standpoint, this is the ideal outcome. The threat was identified before it could be executed. The suspect was arrested. The president was protected. The event proceeded normally, but the lingering uncertainty about whether the threat was real or imagined, whether there were actually other conspirators or just one disturbed individual with a starter pistol, means we'll never know how close Carter came to actual danger that night in Los Angeles. And sometimes that ambiguity is more unsettling than knowing the full truth. As we move further down the list, the threats become more distant, more easily disrupted, more dependent on multiple points of failure. But as we'll see, even a threat that seems absurd or impossible can have very real consequences if the security response isn't fast enough. George W. Bush, 2005. George W. Bush was in Tbilisi, Georgia, the country, not the state, on May 10th, 2005. He was there for a speech in Freedom Square, celebrating the Rose Revolution and Georgia's movement toward democracy. International trips are always complex from a security standpoint. You're operating in foreign territory, coordinating with foreign security services, dealing with local crowds and local threat environments that your agents may not be familiar with. Bush was giving a speech from behind a podium on a stage, with a massive crowd gathered in the square. Tens of thousands of people, all there to see the American president speak about freedom and democracy. It was the kind of event that looks great for diplomatic purposes, but is a nightmare for security planners. And then someone threw a grenade at the president. Not toward the president, not near the president, at the president. A live Soviet-era RGD-5 hand grenade, wrapped in a red tartan handkerchief to disguise it, was thrown from the crowd toward the stage where President Bush was speaking. A grenade is not a precision weapon. It's an area effect weapon designed to kill or maim everyone within a certain radius when it explodes. The RGD-5 has a casualty radius of several meters. If it had detonated anywhere near that stage, multiple people would have been killed or seriously wounded. The president, the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was also on the stage, various dignitaries and officials, and members of the crowd, all would have been in the blast radius. The grenade landed in the crowd, approximately 61 feet from where Bush was standing. That's close. That's well within lethal range if the grenade had detonated. And here's the thing. The grenade was live. It wasn't a dummy. It wasn't a training grenade. It was a real explosive device with a real detonator. And someone had pulled the pin and thrown it at the President of the United States during a public speech in a foreign country. And it didn't explode. The grenade malfunctioned. The mechanism failed. The tartan handkerchief that had been wrapped around it apparently prevented the striker lever from releasing properly when the pin was pulled, which meant the firing mechanism never engaged, which meant the detonator never fired, which meant the grenade just sat there, a live explosive device, sitting in a crowd, not exploding. Someone in the crowd picked it up, not realizing what it was, and moved it. Other people saw it and didn't understand the significance. It wasn't until later, after the event was over, that investigators pieced together what had happened. They found the grenade, they analyzed it, they traced the trajectory, they reviewed video footage, and they realized that someone had attempted to assassinate the president with a hand grenade during a public speech, and the only reason it failed was because of a mechanical malfunction caused by a handkerchief. The would-be assassin was eventually identified as Vladimir Arutyunian, a Georgian man who was apparently opposed to both the Georgian government and the American presence in the region. He was arrested 3 months later after a confrontation with police in which he killed a Georgian police officer. He was eventually convicted of the assassination attempt and sentenced to life in prison. But the really terrifying thing about this incident is how close it came to being a complete disaster. If that handkerchief hadn't interfered with the mechanism, if the grenade had functioned as designed, President Bush would likely have been killed along with numerous other people. The stage wasn't far enough away for safety. There wasn't adequate protection between the crowd and the platform. A properly functioning grenade at that distance would have caused catastrophic casualties. This ranks as number 10 on the list because, while the weapon was lethal and the intent was clear, the execution failed before the device could even begin to function. The grenade never got close to detonating. The threat was neutralized not by security response, but by mechanical failure. And the failure happened early enough in the sequence, the striker lever never released, that the device never posed an imminent danger despite being a live explosive. It's also notable because no one realized what had happened at the time. Bush continued his speech, unaware that someone had thrown a grenade at him. The Secret Service didn't know until later. The crowd didn't panic. The event proceeded normally. It wasn't until investigators reviewed footage and found the grenade afterward that anyone understood how close the situation had come to disaster. From a security perspective, this represents a failure of perimeter control and crowd screening. Someone got into the square with a live grenade. They got close enough to throw it toward the stage. They executed the attack without being stopped. The only reason Bush survived was pure luck, the mechanical failure of the device. International events present unique security challenges. The Secret Service has to coordinate with foreign security services, who may have different training, different protocols, different levels of capability. They have to operate in unfamiliar environments. They have to deal with crowds that may be screened differently than American crowds. And they have to do all of this while maintaining diplomatic relations and not appearing to distrust their host country's security apparatus. The Georgia incident led to reviews of security protocols for international trips. Questions were asked about crowd screening, about perimeter control, about how someone could get a live grenade into a public square where the American president was speaking. Changes were made, protocols were tightened. Future trips would have enhanced security measures. But for George W. Bush on that day in May 2005, survival came down to a handkerchief wrapped around a grenade, interfering with a mechanical mechanism just enough to prevent detonation. No security response, no protective equipment, no quick thinking agents, just a failure of the weapon to function as designed. And as we continue down the list, we'll see more examples of threats that were disrupted before execution, plots that were discovered in time, and situations where the security system worked as intended, rather than relying on mechanical failures or lucky coincidences. William Howard Taft, 1909. William Howard Taft was not yet president when someone decided he shouldn't become president. He was president-elect, having won the 1908 election and preparing for his inauguration on March 4th, 1909. Inauguration Day was still a significant public event, with parades and crowds and all the ceremonial aspects that come with transferring power, and security was considerably less sophisticated than what we'd recognize today. The plot that was uncovered involved explosives, not a pistol, not a rifle, not a direct personal attack. Someone had apparently decided that the most effective way to kill the incoming president was to blow him up during the inauguration parade route. It's a different kind of threat than what we've discussed so far. More impersonal, but potentially more devastating in terms of casualties if it had been executed successfully. The details of the plot are somewhat murky, which is often the case with threats that are discovered and disrupted before they can be carried out. What we know is that authorities received intelligence about a plan to place explosives along the route that Taft would travel during the inauguration ceremonies. The explosives were apparently intended to detonate as Taft's carriage passed, killing him and likely numerous other people in the vicinity. This was 1909, remember. Explosives technology was advancing rapidly during this period. Dynamite had been invented in the 1860s and was widely available, used in mining and construction, and Unfortunately, also in anarchist bombings that had been occurring with some frequency in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There had been several high profile bombings in American cities. The idea of using explosives for political assassination was not unprecedented. The Secret Service and local law enforcement took the threat seriously. They conducted searches along the parade route. They investigated the intelligence they'd received. They changed security protocols and potentially altered the route itself, though the exact details of what countermeasures were taken aren't fully documented in the historical record. What is documented is that the inauguration proceeded without incident. Taft took the oath of office, delivered his inaugural address, and participated in the parade through Washington without being blown up. No explosives were found and detonated. No arrests were made of people actively attempting to place bombs. The threat, whatever its exact nature, was neutralized before it could be executed. This is where things get complicated from a historical perspective. When a threat is stopped before it becomes an actual attempt, when the plot is disrupted in the planning or preparation phase, it's difficult to assess how real the danger actually was. Was this a credible plot with actual conspirators who had acquired explosives and were planning specific actions? Or was this intelligence about a vague threat that may or may not have had substance? The historical record doesn't give us complete answers. There are references to the threat in Secret Service reports and in some contemporary accounts, but there isn't the kind of detailed documentation we'd have today with arrests, trials, evidence presented in court, and extensive investigative reports. The plot was described as serious enough to warrant heightened security measures, but not serious enough to cancel or significantly alter the inauguration ceremonies. Taft himself apparently wasn't particularly concerned about security threats. He was famously genial and accessible, not someone who worried excessively about personal danger. He was a large man, over 300 pounds at various points in his presidency, and he had a calm, steady temperament that didn't lend itself to anxiety about what might happen. He trusted his security detail to handle threats and focused on the responsibilities of the office he was about to assume. This incident ranks as number 11 on the list because of the distance between the threat and execution. No explosives were actually placed. No attempt was made to detonate anything. The plot was discovered and disrupted while still in a preparatory phase, which is the ideal outcome from a security standpoint, but which also means we never found out how real the danger actually was. It's also ranked lower because explosives along a parade route, while potentially devastating, represent a different kind of threat than a direct attack with firearms at close range. The explosives would have to be placed correctly, timed correctly, and would have to function correctly. There are more points of failure in a bombing plot compared to someone with a gun at close range. More can go wrong, more can be disrupted, but it's still notable as an early example of the Secret Service working to prevent assassination attempts before they could be carried out. This wasn't a reactive response to an attack in progress. This was proactive intelligence work, investigation, and security planning that successfully kept a president-elect safe during a vulnerable public ceremony. Taft went on to serve a single term as president from 1909 to 1913. His presidency was politically complicated. He struggled to maintain the progressive coalition that Theodore Roosevelt had built, and his decisions disappointed many of his supporters. He lost the 1912 election when Roosevelt ran against him as a third-party candidate, splitting the Republican vote and allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win. But Taft's post-presidential career was actually more distinguished than his presidency. He was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921, becoming the only person in American history to serve as both President and Chief Justice. He served on the court until shortly before his death in 1930, and by most accounts, he was happier and more effective as Chief Justice than he had been as President. None of that would have happened if the plot against him in 1909 had succeeded. His presidency, his Supreme Court tenure, His entire post inauguration life depended on the Secret Service successfully disrupting whatever threat existed along that parade route. The incident also highlights how much presidential security has evolved. In 1909, the Secret Service was still a relatively small agency, and their protective responsibilities were limited. They didn't have the technology, the personnel, or the protocols that would develop over the following decades. They were working with intelligence networks that were primitive by modern standards, investigating threats without the benefit of surveillance cameras or electronic monitoring or databases of known threats. The fact that they successfully identified and neutralized this particular threat speaks to the dedication and skill of the agents involved. Working with limited resources in an era when presidential protection was still figuring out what it needed to be. And as we continue down the list into even more distant and more easily disrupted threats, we'll see how the nature of presidential security continued to evolve, sometimes in response to successful attacks, and sometimes in response to threats that were stopped before they could become attacks. Richard Nixon, 1974. Richard Nixon's entry on this list is one of the stranger ones, not because the threat wasn't real, but because the method was so bizarre and the execution was so incompetent that it almost seems like dark comedy rather than a genuine assassination attempt. February 22nd, 1974. Nixon was president, though he was deep into the Watergate scandal that would eventually force his resignation 6 months later. He was living in the White House, working through what was probably the most stressful period of his presidency, dealing with investigations and subpoenas and the slow collapse of his political support. And on that February night, a man named Samuel Bike decided he was going to kill the president by hijacking an airplane and crashing it into the White House. This was 1974, remember? This was almost 30 years before September 11th, 2001. The idea of using a hijacked airplane as a weapon wasn't something that most people had seriously considered. Airport security was minimal. You could walk onto planes with relatively little screening. The concept of suicide terrorism involving aircraft wasn't part of the national security conversation. Bike had planned this out after his fashion. He'd made recordings explaining his motivations. He'd written letters. He'd thought about the logistics, though not particularly well. His plan was to hijack a Delta Airlines flight from Baltimore Washington International Airport, force the pilots to take off, and then make them crash the plane into the White House, killing himself, everyone on the plane, and hopefully the president. There were several problems with this plan. First, the White House is not particularly close to BWI Airport. It's about 30 miles away. A hijacked plane would have to fly that distance, maintain control, navigate to the White House, and then somehow crash into it accurately. This requires the cooperation of the pilots or the ability to fly the plane yourself, neither of which Bike had secured. Second, the White House, while not designed as a fortress, is not an easy target for an airplane attack. It's a relatively small building in the context of aerial targeting. Missing by even a small margin means crashing into the surrounding area instead, which would be devastating but wouldn't necessarily kill the president. Third, and most fatally for Bick's plan, he didn't account for how difficult it would actually be to hijack a plane and force it to take off. Bick went to the airport armed with a revolver and a gasoline bomb. He stormed onto Delta Flight 523, which was parked at the gate preparing for departure to Atlanta. He shot an airport security officer who tried to stop him. He entered the plane and immediately shot the co-pilot. He ordered the pilot to take off. The pilot, understandably, told him the plane couldn't take off until the wheel blocks were removed and the boarding ramp was retracted. These are external to the aircraft. The pilot can't remove them from inside the cockpit. Bike apparently hadn't considered this aspect of aviation logistics. Bike became increasingly agitated. He shot the pilot. He started yelling at passengers and flight attendants to help him get the plane moving, which obviously they couldn't do because they didn't have access to the ground equipment either. Meanwhile, police were responding. The airport security officer Bick had shot had triggered an alarm before he died. Law enforcement was converging on the plane, and Bick was trapped in an aircraft that was going nowhere, with two dead or dying pilots and no way to execute his plan. Police surrounded the plane and began shooting at it. Bike was wounded by return fire. Realizing his plan had failed completely, he shot himself in the head. The entire incident was over in about 10 minutes. Two people were dead, the security officer and Bick himself. The co-pilot was seriously wounded but survived. The pilot survived with less serious injuries. Nixon was never in any actual danger. The plane never took off. It never got anywhere near the White House. The threat was contained at the airport before the plan could even begin to be executed. This ranks as number 12 on the list specifically because of how far the threat was from actually reaching the president. The plan was ambitious in concept but deeply flawed in execution. Bick had several layers of obstacles to overcome: hijacking the plane, getting it airborne, flying it to Washington, locating the White House from the air, and crashing into it with enough accuracy and force to kill the president. He failed at the second step. It's also notable as an early example of using aircraft as weapons, a tactic that wouldn't be successfully executed until 2001. Bike's attempt demonstrated both the theoretical possibility of this approach and the practical difficulties involved. You can't just hijack a plane and crash it into a specific building. There are multiple points where the plan can fail, and in Bike's case, it failed almost immediately. The incident did lead to some improvements in airport security, though nothing like the comprehensive security measures that would be implemented after 9/11. There was increased awareness of the need to protect aircraft on the ground. Security personnel were given better training and equipment, but the fundamental vulnerabilities that Bike had exploited, minimal screening, easy access to aircraft, limited security presence, remained largely unaddressed for another 27 years. Bike's motivation was apparently a mixture of personal grievances and political anger. He'd had various failures in his personal and professional life. He blamed the government, and specifically Nixon, for his problems. He'd been investigated by the Secret Service before for making threats. He was on their radar as a potential problem, but there wasn't enough to arrest him or prevent him from carrying out his plan until he actually acted. The recordings he made before the attack revealed a man who was deeply troubled, disconnected from reality in some ways, but also methodical in his planning. He wasn't acting impulsively. He'd thought about this. He'd prepared. He just hadn't prepared well enough or realistically enough about what would actually be required to execute his plan. Nixon was informed of the incident after it was over. He wasn't evacuated from the White House. He wasn't put into any kind of protective protocol. The threat never got close enough to trigger those responses. It was contained and neutralized at the airport, and Nixon continued with his day, probably with more pressing concerns about Watergate than about the failed hijacking attempt. But the incident remains in the historical record as one of the stranger assassination attempts against an American president, notable more for what it attempted than for how close it came to succeeding. Calvin Coolidge, 1929. Calvin Coolidge was nearing the end of his presidency in 1929. He'd chosen not to run for re-election. His famous statement, "I do not choose to run," became one of the most analyzed political declarations of the era, and he was in the final year of his time in office. Coolidge was known for being taciturn, famously quiet, earning the nickname Silent Call for his economy with words. He was not a man who attracted drama or sought attention, which makes it somewhat ironic that he ended up on a list of presidents who faced assassination threats. The incident in question happened in December of 1929, and it's one of those threats that gets ranked low on danger lists, not because the intent wasn't there, but because the execution never got close to the president and was stopped so early that it barely qualified as an attempt. an armed man managed to get onto the White House grounds. His name has been lost to some historical accounts. He wasn't famous, he didn't succeed, and documentation from that era wasn't always as comprehensive as what we have today. But what we know is that he was armed, he had gained unauthorized access to the White House grounds, and he was subsequently arrested by White House security before he could get anywhere near the president. The White House in 1929 was a very different place, security wise, than it is today. The grounds were more accessible, the fence was lower, the security presence was smaller. You could potentially walk onto the White House grounds without immediately being stopped if you looked like you belonged there, and if security personnel were occupied elsewhere. It wasn't quite the public space it had been in earlier eras. By the 1800s, people could literally walk into the White House and wander around. But it also wasn't the fortress with multiple security perimeters that exists today. So, when this armed individual got onto the grounds, it represented a security failure in the sense that he shouldn't have been able to access that space with a weapon. But it also represented a security success in that he was identified and arrested before he could get anywhere near President Coolidge or any other occupants of the White House. We don't have detailed documentation about his motivations. We don't know if he had a specific plan or if this was more of an impulse decision. We don't know if he made threats or simply had a weapon in the wrong place at the wrong time. The historical record from this incident is frustratingly sparse, which is often the case with threats that are stopped very early and don't result in dramatic confrontations or court cases that produce extensive documentation. What we can say is that someone with a weapon got onto the White House grounds with what appeared to be ill intent toward the president, and that person was stopped by the security response before any direct threat to Coolidge materialized. This ranks as number 13 on the list, the lowest ranking, specifically because the threat was so far from execution. The intruder never saw the president. He never fired a weapon. He was apparently nowhere near actually carrying out whatever plan he might have had. The threat was contained at the outermost layer of security, which is exactly how protection is supposed to work, but which also means the level of danger was minimal. It's also ranked low because of the limited information we have. When we don't know the full details of a threat, the motivation, the specific plan, the level of preparation, it's difficult to assess how serious it actually was. Was this someone who had carefully planned an assassination and was stopped before he could execute it? Or was this someone who made a poor decision to bring a weapon onto restricted grounds without necessarily having a concrete plan to harm the president? The lack of contemporary newspaper coverage or detailed Secret Service reports suggests that the incident was either kept quiet deliberately or wasn't considered significant enough to warrant extensive documentation. In an era before 24-hour news cycles and when presidential security matters were often handled with more discretion, it's possible that this threat was investigated, the individual was arrested or sent for psychiatric evaluation, and the whole matter was resolved without public fanfare. Coolidge himself probably never knew the full details, or if he did, he didn't comment on them publicly. This was consistent with his general approach to the presidency. Coolidge was not someone who sought the spotlight or dramatized threats to his person. He governed quietly, spoke rarely, and approached the office with a kind of understated competence that was very different from the more charismatic or dominating presidential styles of some of his predecessors and successors. His presidency is often remembered for the economic prosperity of the 1920s, though that prosperity was built on unstable foundations that would collapse in the stock market crash of October 1929, just months after this incident. Coolidge left office in March of 1930, having presided over an era of apparent peace and prosperity that was about to transform into the Great Depression. The fact that he faced an assassination threat, even a relatively distant and easily neutralized one, is a reminder that no president is completely safe. Even the quiet ones, the ones who don't court controversy or make dramatic decisions, face threats from individuals who decide for their own reasons that the president needs to be removed from office. Presidential security in the 1920s was evolving but still relatively primitive. The Secret Service had been protecting presidents since the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, but the agency was still small and their resources were limited. They didn't have the technology we take for granted today. No surveillance cameras, no metal detectors, no electronic monitoring systems. Security relied on human vigilance, physical barriers, and the hope that potential threats could be identified before they got too close. The fact that this armed intruder was identified and arrested suggests that the system was working, at least at a basic level. Someone saw something wrong, someone responded, and the threat was neutralized. It's not the sophisticated multi-layered security apparatus that protects presidents today, but for 1929, it was apparently sufficient. After this incident, there may have been reviews of White House security procedures. There may have been changes to how the grounds were patrolled or how access was controlled. But any such changes would have been modest compared to the sweeping security enhancements that would come after later, more serious assassination attempts and successful assassinations. Coolidge left office without any further known threats to his safety. He retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he lived quietly with his wife Grace until his death in January of 1933. He wrote his autobiography, practiced law occasionally, and generally stayed out of the political spotlight. His post-presidency was as understated as his presidency had been. The armed intruder from December 1929 became a footnote in history, if he's remembered at all. He didn't succeed in harming the president. He didn't even get close. He's a name in a security report somewhere, a moment of concern that was quickly resolved. A reminder that even in quieter times, even with quieter presidents, the threat of political violence is always present at some level. And that brings us to the end of our journey through presidential near misses, mechanical failures, and the occasional absurd plot involving starter pistols or hijacked planes that couldn't take off. 13 separate times, someone decided that killing the president was worth attempting. 13 times, through a combination of luck, quick reactions, mechanical failure, and occasionally competent security work, the attempt failed. Some by inches, some by seconds, some by the width of a handkerchief wrapped around a grenade. History often turns on moments measured in inches and seconds. A slight turn of the head, a bullet that ricochets instead of penetrating, 2 guns that mysteriously misfire, a Secret Service agent who happens to look in the right direction at exactly the right moment. We like to think that history is inevitable, that the arc of events follows some kind of logical progression, but really, it's chaos, held together by institutional guardrails and an enormous amount of luck. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful you're not in a job where people occasionally try to shoot you, blow you up, or crash planes into your house. And remember, somewhere in a museum, there's a bullet-riddled speech manuscript and a pair of metal glasses that changed the course of the 20th century. Sleep tight.